They said it was impossible, that no one in their right mind would dare cross the HOA president. But explain this. One morning, I woke to find strangers marking boundaries across the land my family had passed down for generations. Stakes hammered into the soil, glossy blueprints taped to fences, and whispers spreading that a multi-million-dollar dream home would soon rise where my childhood memories lived. Each night, the roar of trucks grew louder, their headlights crawling past my window like thieves, measuring what they'd already decided was theirs. I counted every rumble in my chest and asked myself, how much would they take before I finally struck back? Tell me, would you have stayed silent or fought? I grew up believing the land beneath my feet was more than dirt and stone. It was a promise. My parents had bought it decades earlier, long before committees and covenants came to claim authority over what families could or couldn't do in their own yards. To me, the acres weren't just property lines on a map. They were summers chasing fireflies, winters skating across frozen puddles, and the quiet kind of comfort you only feel when you know the ground is genuinely yours. By the time I inherited it, the community had changed. What was once a sleepy stretch of homes surrounded by woods had become a planned neighborhood, complete with gates, glossy newsletters, and a board of people who mistook their titles for crowns. At first, I tried to ignore them. Their notices slipped into mailboxes, filled with bold rules about fence heights, mailbox colors, and even the kind of flowers that matched community standards. I shrugged, thinking none of it really applied to me. After all, this was my family's land, bought and paid for long before any HOA bylaws existed. Neighbors, though, began to whisper about standards. They glanced at my unpaved driveway, my aging barn, and the way I let wildflowers creep freely across the field. Some smiled politely in public, but shared sharper opinions behind closed doors, siding with the board that wanted uniformity more than individuality. The president herself, with her polished smile and manicured nails, made a point of welcoming me with a tone that felt less like kindness and more like inspection. Still, life was manageable. I kept to myself, cared for the property, and told myself the HOA's reach would never stretch this far. I was wrong. Because beneath those glossy rules and neighborly nods, a plan was already brewing. One that would test every ounce of patience I had and threaten to erase the very ground my parents fought to leave behind. At first, the warnings came like passing clouds. Light, temporary, easy to brush aside. A letter, neatly folded, was stamped with the HOA's official crest and placed in my mailbox. Friendly reminder, it read, followed by a bullet point list of infractions: grass too long, mailbox non-standard, barn unsightly. The language was polite enough, but I could feel the bite beneath the words. It wasn't a reminder, it was a warning shot. I tossed it on the kitchen table, muttering to myself that this land wasn't theirs to regulate. But within a week, another letter arrived. This one bolder, with red ink stamped across the top. Notice of violation. They claimed my driveway didn't meet community aesthetic requirements. My driveway. The same gravel path my father had laid down with his own hands, a path that had guided trucks, tractors, and countless childhood footsteps. Neighbors began to notice, too. Some avoided eye contact when they drove by, while others waved stiffly, their eyes lingering a little too long. Word spread fast in this community, and the HOA fed it like wildfire. Suddenly, I wasn't just the quiet homeowner on inherited land. I was the problem. The one who didn't fit in. Then came the fines. At first it was $50 for the mailbox. A week later, $100 for the barn. Another $150 for overgrown weeds. The numbers stacked higher and higher, each finer and more absurd than the last. I could have ignored them. After all, this land wasn't legally under their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them from sending threats. Failure to pay may result in legal action, the bold text warned. My nights grew restless, not because of the money, but because of the principle. I started keeping a folder, every letter neatly filed in order, proof of their harassment. But as the pages grew thicker, so did the tension. It wasn't just paper anymore. One morning, I woke to the sound of engines outside. Trucks, construction trucks, idling at the edge of my property. Men with clipboards stood shoulder to shoulder with the HOA president herself, pointing, measuring, marking. My chest tightened as I watched her, dressed in her usual designer blazer, heels sinking into the soil as if it already belonged to her. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that said more than words ever could. This is mine now. I marched outside, demanding answers. But all I got were vague statements about community improvements and future development plans. No permission. No signatures. Just confidence. She walked my land as though she'd been waiting for this moment for years. By nightfall, stakes had been driven into the ground, strings stretched taut between them, and survey flags fluttered in the breeze. My land wasn't just under threat. It was being claimed in plain sight. That was the moment the letters stopped, and the real war began. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow-motion ambush. Every day there was something new on my property that hadn't been there the night before. Fresh markers, neon spray paint on the grass, piles of lumber stacked neatly as if construction had already been approved. I called the county office, demanded to know how this could happen without permits or signatures, but they were evasive. The HOA has submitted development plans, one clerk said. You'll need to resolve this with them directly. Resolve? How do you resolve someone building their empire on your inheritance? Soon, brochures began circulating in mailboxes around the neighborhood. Full-color spreads showing Phase 2 of the community vision. Right there, splashed across the glossy pages, was my land, complete with a digital rendering of a sprawling $6 million villa, infinity pool and all. My barn? Erased. My driveway? Replaced with a marble walkway. The caption read, "The future of our neighborhood begins here." The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Neighbors I had known for years stood in their driveways, brochures in hand, nodding approvingly. Some even congratulated the HOA president for her ambition. To them, this wasn't theft. It was progress, and I was just an obstacle in the way. The construction noise grew relentless. Engines roared through the night, headlights flashed across my bedroom walls, and strangers wandered the property like tourists on a guided tour. Each time I confronted them, they waved contracts and plans in my face, documents thick with legal jargon and signatures I had never seen before. Then came the ultimate insult. A letter, hand-delivered by the HOA president herself. She stood at my door, perfume strong enough to choke, and handed me the envelope with a smile. Inside was a final notice, a demand that I vacate the property within 30 days for community redevelopment. It was so brazen, so absurd, that for a moment I laughed out loud. But that laughter didn't last. Because stapled to the notice was something worse, a list of fines now totaling over $25,000. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were trying to drown me in debt. My nights became a blur of sleepless pacing, folder in hand, reading and rereading every violation notice, every threat. The walls of my house felt smaller with each passing day, the weight of their pressure pressing in. And yet something inside me began to shift. Fear hardened into resolve. I stopped throwing their brochures in the trash. Instead, I collected them. I stopped crumpling their violation letters. Instead, I documented them, photographed them, and filed them away. If they thought they could push me into a corner, they hadn't realized one thing. I knew this land better than anyone, and I had something they didn't. The deed. Locked in a fireproof safe, untouched for years, my parents' original purchase documents sat waiting, signed, notarized, ironclad. The HOA might have power, money, and neighbors under their spell, but they couldn't erase history, and so, while they poured millions into steel, glass, and marble rising on soil they didn't own, I started preparing, patiently, quietly, letting them dig deeper into their own arrogance. Dollar by dollar, day by day, the trucks came and went. The walls of the villa rose higher, casting long shadows across my yard. Neighbors whispered about its beauty, marveling at the president's vision. They had no idea they were standing on a ticking time bomb, and every night, As I sat in the dark watching headlights crawl across my windows, one thought kept me awake. They think this land is already theirs. But when the final brick is laid, they'll learn just how wrong they were. The night before the storm broke, I stood at the edge of the property line, staring at the silhouette of the half-finished villa rising like a monument to arrogance. Its steel beams clawed at the sky, its glass panels already glinting under the moonlight. It wasn't just a building, it was a declaration, a brazen insult planted right into the soil my parents had fought to call their own. Every hammer strike, every truck that rumbled through the night felt like a drumbeat of war. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The HOA had spent months tightening the noose. Fines, threats, eviction notices, all attempts to suffocate me into submission. But what they didn't realize was that their empire had been built on sand, and I was holding the tide. It began with a letter of my own, a certified packet delivered not to the HOA's mailbox but to their emergency board meeting, the one they had called to finalize the sale of the villa to a wealthy buyer who'd been promised exclusive ownership, rights. I can still picture the moment they tore it open, expecting another desperate plea, another flimsy protest. Instead, they found my parents' original deed, legally binding, ironclad, predating the very existence of their HOA. But that was only the beginning. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, every fine, every violation notice, every brochure boasting about a villa they had no right to build. I documented the trespasses, photographed the survey stakes, and even recorded the construction trucks tearing across the boundary lines. And when I walked into the county courthouse that morning, folder in hand, I wasn't just another homeowner under siege. I was a plaintiff in a case. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Neighbors sat in the back rows, clutching their brochures like hymn books, waiting to see if their queen would triumph once more. The HOA president sat at the defense table, her lawyer polished and smug, her smile just as sharp as ever. She looked at me like I was a nuisance, a weed she thought had already been pulled. But weeds have roots. When the judge asked me to present my claim, I didn't speak with anger. I spoke with clarity. I laid out the deed page by page. I showed the date of purchase, decades before the HOA had even existed. I presented photographs of their trucks crossing my property, their survey markers stabbing into my soil, their brochures advertising what was never theirs to sell. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer, and with every strike, I watched the president's smile falter. Her lawyer objected, spun tales of community progress and collective vision. But the law doesn't bend for ambition. And when the judge leaned forward, scanning the deed, his words cut through the courtroom like thunder. This property predates the HOA. Their authority does not extend to this land. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then came the gasp, the collective intake of breath from neighbors who realized they had been cheering for a lie. The villa, their shining symbol of progress, had been built on stolen ground. The president tried to recover, raising her voice, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that permits had been granted, that I had failed to comply with community standards. But the judge wasn't swayed. He slammed the gavel and declared what I had been waiting to hear all along. The land, every inch of it, was mine. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no authority, no claim. And then came the final blow. Because of the trespassing, the harassment, and the illegal construction, the court ordered the HOA to compensate me, not just for damages, but for every cent they had poured into that villa. Millions. Their crown jewel. Their $6 million monument now belonged to me. The president's face drained of color. The smug confidence she had paraded through the neighborhood evaporated in seconds. Neighbors who once praised her avoided her gaze, their glossy brochures suddenly worthless scraps of paper. She had built her empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and in one ruling, it all crumbled. But the humiliation didn't end in the courtroom. Word spread faster than wildfire. Local news stations picked up the story. HOA builds mansion on wrong land. Reporters camped outside the gates, eager for a glimpse of the fallen queen. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes, shaking their heads, some in pity, others in satisfaction. The woman who had ruled with an iron fist, who had fined people for mailbox colors and flower choices, was now the face of arrogance undone. I remember walking back onto my land that evening, the sun setting behind the unfinished villa. For months, it had haunted me, towering over my memories, threatening to erase my family's legacy. Now it stood as proof of my patience, my resolve, my victory. I ran my hand along the cold steel beams, not with bitterness, but with a quiet satisfaction. They had built me a palace, and in their arrogance, they had given it away, and as I stood there, watching the last rays of daylight dance across the glass, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. They thought they had broken me. But in the end, they built their own downfall. The days following the court's decision felt almost unreal, like stepping into a dream I had been chasing for months. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air around my home was quiet. No trucks, no engines, no pounding hammers in the night. The construction site that had once tormented me now stood frozen, silent as a monument to arrogance. The workers packed up their tools, the contractors pulled out their machines, and all that remained was a half-finished shell of glass and steel, waiting for its rightful owner and waiting for me. Neighbors didn't know what to say at first. Some avoided me entirely, embarrassed that they had stood by the president's side when she marched onto my land. Others offered cautious congratulations, their voices tinged with guilt. A few even admitted, in hushed tones, that they had doubted me, thought I was paranoid, or assumed the HOA must have been in the right. But now they looked at me differently. Not as the outsider or the troublemaker, but as the one who had stood against the machine and won. The HOA itself was in shambles. The president resigned within a week of the ruling, her once flawless reputation shattered. Rumors spread that she had sunk her personal savings into the villa project, believing she would profit tenfold when the property sold. Instead, she was left with nothing but debt and humiliation. The board members who had backed her tried to distance themselves, but their names were all over the brochures, the meeting minutes, the contracts. They couldn't escape the fallout. The fines they had piled on me, every dollar of harassment they thought would break me, were not just canceled but flipped on their heads. The court awarded damages for stress, trespassing, and unauthorized construction. The check that arrived in the mail weeks later was more than compensation. It was vindication. Every late-night worry, every headlight that cut across my window, every sleepless hour pacing the floors, it was all acknowledged, all validated. And then came the villa itself. Walking through the half-finished mansion for the first time was surreal. Marble floors still wrapped in protective plastic, chandeliers boxed up in crates, staircases leading to nowhere. It was like wandering through a dream half forgotten. This wasn't something I had asked for, but it was something I had earned. They had built their empire on my soil, and now every brick, every beam, every pane of glass belonged to me. I didn't rush to finish it. I let it stand, unfinished, a towering reminder of what happens when greed blinds people to the truth. Neighbors drove by slowly, stealing glances at the empty structure. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled faintly as if to say, justice served. The president herself never came near again. I heard she had moved out of the community entirely, unable to face the whispers, the shame, the eyes that once looked up to her but now saw her for what she really was. But beyond the victory, something deeper changed in me. For months I had lived in fear, afraid of letters, scared of fines, fearful of losing the land my family entrusted to me. And yet, in standing my ground, I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. The HOA tried to strip me of my history, but in fighting back, I became more connected to it than ever before. This land wasn't just dirt and stone. It was a legacy. And legacy is worth protecting. The community itself shifted too. Where once the board ruled with unchecked authority, neighbors now questioned every decision, demanded transparency, and refused to follow rules that served egos more than fairness. The HOA still existed, but its power had been fractured. The glossy newsletters stopped boasting about visions and developments. Instead, they were filled with cautious reminders about lawn care and meeting dates. Back to basics, stripped of the grandeur they once flaunted. People began approaching me not with suspicion but with curiosity. They asked how I had done it, how I had stood against the HOA machine. Some shared their own stories, about fines for flower beds, warnings for garden gnomes, threats over paint colors. For the first time, they realized they weren't powerless. My fight had become a symbol, a reminder that these boards were not kings and queens, but committees with limits. And yet, even with victory secured, I kept the brochures. Every glossy page advertising the villa. Every staged rendering of my land transformed into someone else's dream. I kept them in the same folder as the violation notices and threats, not as trophies, but as reminders. Reminders that complacency invites overreach, that silence enables arrogance, and that the fight for what's yours sometimes requires patience measured in months, not moments. In the evenings, I would walk the property, the same paths I had wandered since childhood. The fields, the barn, the gravel driveway, all still mine, all standing. The villa loomed at the edge, a giant of steel and glass, but instead of casting a shadow over my memories, it stood as proof of resilience, proof that even the most powerful bully can crumble when confronted with the truth. Some nights, I'd catch the reflection of the unfinished glass walls under the moonlight. I'd think back to the nights I couldn't sleep, when headlights cut across my window and I wondered how much they would take before I broke. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the end, it wasn't me who failed. It was them. Neighbors began to say the land looked different now. Not just because of the villa, but because of the weight it carried. They said it felt freer, lighter, like a spell had been broken. For me, it was more personal. I could breathe again. I could sleep without fear of engines roaring across my yard. And every morning as the sun rose over the fields, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing the land was safe. Not just for me, but for whatever comes after me. The takeaway? Simple. Power only works if you give in to it. The HOA president believed her title, influence, and wealth gave her the right to erase me. She forgot one thing: paper trails don't lie. Deeds don't vanish. And when you strip away the intimidation, the fines, and the threats, the truth stands taller than any mansion. To anyone watching this, remember, they can send letters, they can stack fines, they can flood your nights with fear. But none of that matters if you know what's yours and you're willing to defend it. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't shouting or fighting or striking back in anger. Sometimes the greatest revenge is patience, waiting, documenting, letting arrogance build itself into a trap, and then watching as it collapses under its own weight. And so I ask you, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the system, even when it seemed stacked against you? Or would you have stood your ground even when the whole neighborhood sided with the enemy? Because in the end, that's the choice we all face when power tries to push us off our own soil, bow quietly, or fight with everything we have. And I promise you, when you choose the fight, when you choose patience, the victory tastes sweeter than you can ever imagine. And now, when I walk through that half-finished villa, hearing the echo of my own footsteps in the hollow halls, I don't see their dream. I see justice. I see the proof that no matter how strong they seemed, no matter how loud their engines roared or how bright their headlights burned through the night, I was still here. The land was still mine, and in the end, the only empire that stood was the one my parents built for me, brick by brick, memory by memory, deed by deed.